Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our podcast and welcome Dr. Omar Attila Argi.
Hello, Zuleika. Thank you for the invitation again.
It's lovely to have you as always. And I have a very interesting topic and question for you today. Is it possible for us to practice Islam just with the Qur'an, as in without the Hadith, basically? What are your thoughts on this?
Yes. Unfortunately, like these days, there are some groups emerging, they call them Qur'aniyuns. And they argue that, the Prophet should be followed at the time of the prophets when they lived. After they pass away, you don't need to follow prophets. You gotta follow what they brought, And now they're using this for the Quran as well. And they're saying, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent everything in the Quran. And therefore, you don't need to follow the Prophet anymore. You just gotta follow the Quran. And this is very problematic. It is not possible, to live Islam or practice Islam without the Quran. Without the Hadith. The reason for that is, if you look at Islamic rituals and practices, you will see that this is very interesting. About 30% of our practices comes from the Quran. 70% comes from the Sunnah. So we know that the main two sources of Islam is the Quran and the Sunnah. Of course, there are even more specific things, such as fiqh rules, jurisprudence. We also look at, things like ijma, qiyas. We need to have all of these things to understand religion and practice religion.
Sure.
But because we are talking about only the Quran and the Sunnah in this program, we should focus on the Sunnah. And we know that it needs to be followed if we are truly following Islam. Mainly the mainstream Islam, which we call Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaat, because you can have a look at the Quran. As I remember, Ali Imran verse 31 says, "Kul in kuntum tuhibbuna Allah, fattabi'uni yuhibbukumullah." Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Say, O my beloved messenger, if you love Allah, then you follow me." Very clear. And there are a number of verses like that in the Quran which encourages the believers to follow the noble Prophet ﷺ. I remember, debating on this topic with few people who, consider themselves as Qur'aniyun. And I asked one of them, I said, "Do you pray 5 times a day?" The person said, "Yes." I said, "How do you practice the rakats of the, each prayer? Like if you pray Maghrib 3 rakats, where do you get that from? There's no such a thing in the Quran." So who taught the prayer to us? Who taught all the particulars of worship to us? It's Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Moreover, they keep on saying, they go back to the thing, Quran, they keep on saying, where does that written in the Quran? Where is it written in the Quran? Now, this is not a way to explain things, because the Quran was revealed to, as you know, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself, even his companions at the time, when they couldn't understand certain verses or terminologies, they would ask the Prophet himself. They would say, what does this mean?
Exactly.
O Messenger of Allah. And he would explain it in detail. So the wahi, the revelation, directly addresses the Prophet. As you know, in the Quran, there are many verses which start with Qul, say. It's always addressing the noble Prophet ﷺ. So how could you live religion or understand the Quran without the Prophet? And I think this is a very dangerous thing these days, and I think it's being done systematically. I don't know who's behind it, but there's some sort of a thing, systematic power behind it. They're just trying to separate, the Hadith and Sunnah from the Quran. So people can be, individualized. So religion, Islam is not a communal religion. It is more individualistic things. Everyone follow their own religion, read the Quran.
So do you think it leads to people interpreting the Quran themselves because they're negating or they're ignoring what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said about these verses and how they should be understood?
Yes.
And therefore, there's a whole lot of different. I guess there is a level of interpretation of the Quran possible, but this is taking it to another level, especially in relation to rituals, isn't it?
I think you made a very good point there, because if there was no prophetic hadiths, if there was no Sunnah, every individual, they can just take the Quran and interpret according to, what they understand of it, they would all become, exegesis scholars individually. One would say, oh, the Quran is saying this. The other one would say the Quran is saying this. And that's very problematic when you think about it. But there is like a methodology in understanding the Quran, which we call, Usul al-Tafsir, how we, interpret the Quran. And when you do Usul al-Tafsir or Mufassirs, they are professionals in that field. They spend their entire lives on this, And there is certain principles in making tafsir of the Quran, as you know. The first one is we cannot understand the Quran verse by verse. The Quran needs to be understood as an entirety, unless you understand all the in the whole context. Like I said. Otherwise, if we pluck out some verses and try to interpret them, we'll be making big mistakes. That's one, because one of the principles of Usul al-Tafsir is siyak and sibak. It means, what comes before that particular verse, what comes after it, what is the context, like you said. So if you don't understand all of these things, or
even the Asbab al-Nuzul, like what was the cause of revelation? And when you're talking about that, it's revealed, cause of revelation is based on the Prophet's life as well. So again, his life comes into it one way or another, doesn't it?
Exactly, because Asbab al-Nuzul, of course, there are certain verses in the Quran which is come down with a reason of revelation. And it follows an incident or a question, that occurred at the time, like you said. So it's either some non-believers ask a question to the Prophet, or the companions ask a question, or some incident occurs. Because of that, it's because Quran wasn't just revealed in a day. It took 23 years for all the entire verses to come down. So without knowing all of these things, the background to it, you cannot just take the Quran itself and try to interpret it and say you don't need the Sunnah. Whereas, the Prophet himself, والسلام, in farewell sermon, the Wada khutbah, he addressed about 120,000 Sahabis, companions. And there he said, I'm leaving you, and I am leaving behind two things to you, the Quran and my Sunnah. And I remember one hadith, I can't remember if it's hadith sahih or not, but in which the noble Prophet ﷺ says, in the Ahir Zaman, in the time of fitna, where the times that we are living now, he says, following one of my Sunnah is equal to, the rewards of 100 martyrs. So look how he emphasizes the importance of Sunnah. Without his Sunnah, how are we going to live religion? He's the one who teaches us religion.
And it's quite a new phenomena, isn't it, this? Like you kind of hinted at the beginning, but for 1400 years, until the last century, I suppose, the Quran and the Hadith were very accepted.
Yes.
There was probably a minority that didn't, but it was generally accepted. But we're seeing more of a growth, as you said, of those who are negating the Hadith. And with that, all these challenges and complications really are coming through.
Yes. I think people just want to make things easier for themselves.
Okay.
It's easier to, live religion,
Just going back to that question you asked that person, I don't know if you were, like when you said, how do you do your prayers? What did they actually say?
There was no answer.
No answer, yeah.
There was no answer, I think they just practice what they understand from it, But as I said, there's no clear indication of how the rakats of the thing, each prayer should be done. It's all from the thing. But in this, in relation to this, I think there are people who go to extremes on both sides. Unfortunately, that's why we gotta find that middle path all the time. The Quran says you are ummati wasata. You are the people of the middle path. That's what we call sirat al-mustaqim. We don't go to extremes, But people do go to extremes in this, in regards to this. Some completely neglect hadith altogether, but there are others who are extremists on the other side,
As in blindly accepting everything, do you mean? Or
blindly accepting and making some things compulsory, which are not.
In a way, holding the Hadith and Quran almost equal with their approach to it.
Yeah, and that's another problematic thing. And that generally this group of people are literalists. When you look at their lives, you can see it too. I remember in one of my classes, I was explaining the levels of Sunnah. And I said, there are 3 levels of Sunnah. The one is Sunnah Muakkada, which is emphasized Sunnah, which should be followed. And things like the Prophet never missed the Sunnah of the morning prayer. So you should never miss it too. These are all emphasized Sunnah. And then I said there is Sunnah Gayri Muakkada, which is somewhat emphasized, meaning that the Prophet sometimes did not do it, did not practice it. For example, like the Sunnah of the Asr prayer, one example. Sometimes Prophet did not do it. It means that, it is not very emphasized. You can, sometimes abandon it. And then I said there is the 3rd component, which is Sunnah Zawaid. And Sunnah Zawaid means 2 things. One, they are practices that are personal preferences of the Prophet. How he combs his hair, what color clothes he likes to wear, what sort of food he likes to eat. Also, we can add one more thing to this. Most people, do not add this in there. Cultural things. Cultural things, because those days there was certain culture within the Arabian Peninsula. Culture and religion sometimes get mixed up with people. You have to understand the culture too. If you're saying you have to follow everything, then why are we using cars? Why are we using microphones in mosques? Why do we have minarets in mosques? There was no minarets at the time.
Or apps that tell you the prayer time. We should be following the sun, like looking at the sun.
Yes.
Whereas those would be considered bid'ah. That's another topic for another day, but they're not things that our Prophet used or did.
But that's correct. We don't put a stick to the ground and measure the shadow anymore. We have astronomy which we follow. So if the noble Prophet ﷺ lived these days, he would certainly be using those apps. He would certainly be using that astronomy. Yeah. So I think we should, be very careful from, or avoid, I should say, going into extremes on both sides. You cannot live Islam without Sunnah. There's no doubt about it. Because our beloved Prophet showed us the path.
Yeah. He brought the Qur'an to life, really, when you think about it. Yeah.
He was a living Qur'an.
The living Qur'an.
That's what Hazrat Aisha radiallahu anha says. So to practice Islam, we need to follow the Prophet. Yeah.
Just, I guess, another aspect, I won't expand on it too much maybe, but the Usul of Hadith, the methodology of Hadith, the way it was collected. I think, those maybe who do negate the Hadith completely don't appreciate how much effort went into capturing these hadith and what the Prophet said, what criteria they had, what conditions, and the categories they put. It's when you look at it, especially by the time that when it was all collated, it was such a systematic system.
Yes.
And there's not enough appreciation for that as well.
And these people usually argue from the point of view that there are fabricated hadith. They have been identified as well throughout history. Vigorous work, scholars did. They have been identified as well. And hadith has like categories, as you said, mutawatir, sahih, Hasan Garib, all these different categories. And these towering scholars already did this work. And there are hadiths that you cannot deny. It's impossible for you to deny because one very important thing before maybe we close up, in the Western world today, or in the world of academia, in the universities,
Yes.
When you don't use citations, as you know, when you don't use references, they call it plagiarism, isn't it?
That's right.
It's a very bad thing. It's like stealing. That's what it is, really, when you think about it. You know where that comes from? That system of referencing. It comes from Hadith. Historically, it comes from Hadith. That's where they learned it from. Because
that's where it comes from. And like in academic holds itself high in terms of scholarship, because you have to cite and reference, and if you don't, it's plagiarism. So everyone makes sure, if I say something that doesn't belong to me, I have to reference it. And as you said, with the Hadith, it's very clear. And even when someone cites a Hadith, there's like, well, who did you hear it from, and who did they hear it from, and like there has to be that chain of that connection.
Yeah,
it's
that
very
Sanad
important.
has to be there. Without that referencing,
it's not acceptable. So very high, when you think of it, academic criteria that was set for the Hadith.
So basically, maybe we should say this: you cannot practice Islam only by using the Qur'an. As I said, Qur'an, 30% of Islam is, practical Islam is in the Qur'an. 70% is in the Sunnah, in the Hadith of Noble Prophet.
Yeah, it's very powerful stats. Thank you, Dr. Omar Attila Agha, for sharing that valuable information. See you next time. Assalamu alaikum.